Future world borders. We'll go through each decade of the 21st century all the way to 2100. First off, 2022. Starting in Eastern Europe, Russia launches a large-scale incursion into Ukraine. The West responds by implementing sanctions and sending military supplies to Ukraine, but no war is declared. Russian troops stationed in Kursk and Belarus stage a pincer operation, swiftly rolling over Ukraine's flat terrain and surrounding Kiev in a matter of weeks. Kiev is occupied soon after, and with the Ukrainian army in shambles, eastern Ukraine is taken. Not wanting to overstretch their force, Russia stops around the Dnieper River. What's left of Ukraine is now a rump state between Russia and the West. America not intervening in this war sets a dangerous precedent, which its adversaries will certainly take advantage of in the future. On a less depressing note, COVID restrictions have been lifted in most places and the world economy is making a steady recovery. Anyways, tell me what you think will happen in the 2020s. Future world borders. This time, 2023. This year, Iran finally manufactures its first nuclear missile after 20 years of development. This is due to America's failure to reach a renewed agreement with Iran after their withdrawal from the deal in 2018. The Middle Eastern Cold War between Saudi Arabia and Iran is now heightened, with the Saudis likely pursuing further nuclear development. Next, we turn to Africa. After years of negotiation, the Constitution of the East African Federation is ratified by all 6 participating member states. The EAF is now the largest nation in Africa and has the potential to become Africa's first superpower in the coming decades. Finally, China completes the construction of its first Atlantic overseas base in Equatorial Guinea, threatening American influence in the Atlantic. Anyways, what events do you think will happen in the future? Future world borders. Today, we're going to 2024. This is the year of America's next presidential election. For the candidates, let's just say it's between Biden and Ron DeSantis. Based on current trends, DeSantis manages to edge out Biden and win the presidency. Just like in 2020, the other side claims the election was rigged, likely claiming there was voter suppression. Whether it's true or not does not matter. What matters is the country is now even more divided than before. The country is now closer to civil war since, well, the Civil War, but only time will tell if it will come to fruition. Over in Europe, Scotland holds its second independence referendum, with it decisively voting yes by a narrow margin. This opens up the doors not only to Irish unification, but also to the potential of an independent Catalonia. Finally, Morocco takes control of the rest of Western Sahara, ending the over 50 years of conflict. Anyways, who do you think would win in 2024? Future world borders. Today, we're heading to 2025. In Europe, Belarus finally bites the bullet and unites with Russia. The integration between their economies and military had already been steadily growing, but after the Ukraine war, a political union was fast-tracked. Over in Bosnia, the Republic of Srpska finally breaks away from Bosnia, dividing the nation into two. Soon after, they unite with Serbia proper. Yay, more Balkan border gore. In Asia, China's military now has the capacity to invade Taiwan, and it's only a matter of time before they attempt to break through the first island chain. The US responds to this threat by forming an Indo-Pacific version of NATO, which includes nations such as Japan, Taiwan, India, and Australia. Tensions are at an all-time high and war is on the horizon. How about we take a step back from all this talk of war and go check up on South America? And literally nothing has changed, as always. Anyways, what do you think will happen in the future? Future world borders. This time, 2026. After years of build-up and preparation, China finally launches its assault on Taiwan. It begins by navally blockading the island, attempting to cut it off from global trade and starve it out. Seeing this as an attack on Taiwan, President DeSantis sends much of the US Pacific Fleet to end China's blockade. The US demands China withdraw their ships, but they decline, causing the US to open fire on the Chinese ships. War has started, with the US and allies such as Japan and Australia joining in. America decimates Chinese ships blockading Taiwan, finally freeing the island. America now turns its focus to bombarding coastal ports, launching drone strikes on key military objectives, and using cyber warfare to neutralize the Chinese threat. After months of this, the Chinese people lose faith in the Communist Party's leadership and start revolting against them. The CCP is ousted and China surrenders unconditionally to the American coalition. The Treaty of Beijing is signed, where both Tibet and Xinjiang gain independence, and Taiwan once again becomes China's ruling government, now known as the Republic of China. This is a major victory not only for democracy in Asia, but for world peace. Anyways, what do you think will happen in the future? Future world borders. This time we're going to 2027. Starting in Asia, the DPRK is on its last legs. With China now being a firm American ally, Kim has been backed into a corner. He threatens to annihilate America with nuclear weapons, but he's assassinated by the CIA before he gets a chance. North Korea collapses and the peninsula is united once again after 80 years. Over in Africa, South Africa finally splits up into separate countries. This was a long time coming, as the country's growing divisions had been apparent since as far back as the 2010s. Getting back on the topic of unification, this year Ireland is united as well. After Scottish independence in 2024, support for Irish unification had vastly increased. A referendum was held and the result for unification was yes by a wide margin. Despite this, Wales still remains in the now not so united kingdom. Anyways, what do you expect to happen by 2030? Future world borders. Today we'll be going through 2028 to 2030. Starting off in Asia, sometime during this period, a war between India and Pakistan breaks out over Kashmir. For the sake of not turning this into the Fallout world, we'll just say only conventional warfare is used. Due to their superior military force, India wins the war and takes control over the rest of Kashmir. In China, its new democracy democracy is already showing signs of failure. Living conditions have drastically decreased from before, and corruption is rampant at the local and national level. Many yearn for a return to the stability the CCP's leadership brought, and it's likely that authoritarianism will return to China in the near future. Up north in Canada, Quebec separatists are once again gaining momentum. There's a growing call for another independence referendum. If it succeeds, the existence of Canada as a nation will come into question, as the maritime provinces to the east will be cut off from the rest of the nation. Could this be the end for the Great White North? We'll have to wait and see. Anyways, what do you think will happen in the 2030s? Future world borders, this time 2031 to 2033. And Europe's strides towards federalization in the EU are being made. This is supported by nations like France and Germany, but has much less support among eastern members of the EU. Speaking of Eastern Europe, the Russian satellite state in Ukraine is finally incorporated into Russia proper. In Asia, Tibet reaches an agreement with India. In exchange for financial support and military guarantees, they agreed to recognize all of Kashmir as sovereign Indian territory. Their conflict with China for influence in Tibet is heating up. In East Africa, Somaliland is officially recognized by a majority of UN member states as separate from Somalia. Their 40-year struggle has finally ended, and relations with Somalia are beginning to be normalized. Lastly, due to rising sea levels, some of the Maldives population is beginning to evacuate to other nations. Anyways, what do you think will happen in the future? Future world borders. Today we're going from 2034 to 2036. Starting in Canada, the second referendum for Quebec independence is held. Due to growing Quebec nationalism, the result is easily yes. After a bit of dispute, the Canadian government officially grants Quebec independence. The Maritimes, now being cut off from the rest of Canada, opt to join the US instead of remaining with the rest of the nation. In the Middle East, the Kurds are finally granted a sovereign nation in northern Iraq and Syria. This results in growing calls for independence from Kurds in southeast Turkey. In China, a Putin-style authoritarian leader is elected, essentially returning the country back to a one-party dictatorship. They launch a large-scale invasion to Xinjiang, once again returning the region to its control. In reaction to this, Tibet further strengthens its ties to India, with war between the two Asian giants over Tibet on the horizon. Anyways, what do you think will happen in the future? Future world borders. Today, 2037 to 2039. In Europe, European federalization has reached a critical point. France, Germany, and the Low Countries officially agreed to unite and form the European Federation. This is a monumental achievement, and other EU members soon plan to join the Federation. With it now being able to defend itself from Russia, Europe no longer needs the US as its bodyguard. In Asia, war finally breaks out over Tibet. There's fierce fighting in the Tibetan plateau, with it turning into a months-long stalemate. China utilizes its technological superiority to break through Indian lines and gradually take over the region. They eventually stop at the Indian border, and a peace treaty is signed. China once again controls Tibet, with it now being able to threaten India's already strained water supply. Lastly, Albania and Kosovo unite, which may or may not cause another war in the Balkans. Anyways, what do you think will happen by 2040? Future world borders. This time, 2040 to 2042. Starting in Russia, them and Kazakhstan finally agreed to form a union. This marks the beginning of the Eurasian Union, amplifying the tension between them and the rest of Europe. Speaking of Europe, more EU members joined the new federation. Countries such as Spain and Portugal, as well as Italy and Austria, agreed to join. Most other EU members are working towards joining, with the notable exception of the Nordic states. Despite this, there are talks for greater Nordic cooperation beginning, which could entail a separate Nordic Union in the future. In the Middle East, Kurdistan and Turkey reach a deal over control of the majority Kurdish areas in southeast Turkey. After Kurdistan agrees to economic and military treaties with Turkey, the majority Kurdish areas are given to them. Over in Israel, despite diplomatic efforts by both sides, a peace agreement between them and Palestine has still not been made. And what do you think will happen in the future? Future world borders. This time will go from 2043 to 2045. In Eastern Europe, the Eurasian Union sends a peacekeeping force into Moldova over separatists in Transnistria. Because of so-called Moldovan provocations, they just so happen to take over all of Moldova in an act of self-defense. The European Federation imposes sanctions, but they do essentially nothing. This action speeds up Eastern European nations' federalization plans with Europe. Fortunately for Poland, their integration with Europe is complete, and they joined the Federation. They weren't trying to get invaded for the 100th time. In the Middle East, due to the world's transition to renewable energy, many oil-exporting nations are suffering economically. Unfortunately for the Saudis, they didn't manage to sufficiently diversify their economy and are on the verge of collapse. The same can be said for Venezuela, and I'm sure the CIA won't have any involvement in it. And what do you think the future will bring? Future world borders. Today, 2046 to 2048. In Asia, China and the Eurasian Union officially form a mutual defense pact. This development is not a good sign for world peace, and could indicate the potential for a greater world conflict. The somehow still alive 100-year-old Putin has brought Russia from a second great power to now a global superpower. In China, they've rebounded from the Taiwan War in the 2020s and once again look to gain greater influence in the world. Together, they've exemplified the East-West divide, but only time will tell where this will lead. In North America, Canada and the US unite to form the North American Union. After Quebec independence, large strides were made for integration between the two nations. Over time, this resulted in a strong economic and now political union. And what do you think the future will bring? Future world borders. This time, 2049 to 2051. We finally reached mid-century. Over the past 30 years, humanity has experienced unparalleled unparalleled technological advancement. AI has become integrated in most parts of society, with large strides in medicine also being realized. SpaceX landed the first humans on Mars back in the 2030s, and a permanent settlement on the Red Planet has been established. Despite the transition to green energy, the effects of climate change are still being felt, but the worst case scenario has been avoided. The transition isn't good for all nations though, namely Saudi Arabia. After a sharp economic downturn from decreased fossil fuel demand, the country fell into a civil war. Finally, this led to the division of the country into multiple separate factions, destabilizing the region. Anyways, what do you think will happen in the future? Future world borders. Today we'll go through 2052 to 2054. In Europe, after years of negotiations, the Nordic nations unite to form the Nordic Union. This was caused by a combination of low support for EU integration, fears of Russian expansionism, and a desire for greater regional cooperation. These years aren't all bad for the EU though, as more Eastern members joined the Federation. In the Middle East, the Israeli-Palestine situation is still somehow in limbo, and no concrete peace treaties have been signed. In Africa, most countries have experienced unprecedented growth in the last few decades. The continent is quickly becoming an economic powerhouse, with countries like Nigeria and the East African Federation being some of the world's largest economies. Finally, the North American Federation tries to buy Greenland again. The Nordics again tell them no, especially considering its strategic position in an ever-warming Arctic. And what do you expect to happen in the future? Future world borders. Today we're going to 2055. This year the colonization of Antarctica begins. After the expiration of the Antarctic Treaty in 2048, nations begin enforcing their claims over the continent. In eastern Antarctica, Australia and New Zealand take control of their respective claims. The same goes for the Nordic Union and central Antarctica. A problem arises though when we get to the Antarctic Peninsula, which is claimed by Chile, Argentina, and the UK. Chile agrees to relinquish their claims in return for Mary Birdland, but Argentina and the UK don't budge. This sparks the first Antarctic War. I say war, but it actually ends up being more of a high-stakes staring contest between their two navies. They eventually reach a deal where they split the peninsula between each other, ending the conflict. Anyways, what do you think will happen in the future? Future world borders. This time 2056 to 2058. To start, Putin is dead. This is a tough blow to the Eurasian state, which is already suffering from a severe demographic crisis. Even after annexation, Ukraine was never pacified, and separatists see this as an opportunity to regain independence. With pro-democracy activists becoming increasingly militarized, the country is headed for a brutal civil war. What began as a dream to reform the Soviet Union will ironically mean a similar fate. In South Asia, this is also a terrible time for the Maldives. The entire country is now underwater, but fortunately most of the nation's population had already left the country. You know what? I think we need to take a break and check on South America. And of course, absolutely nothing has happened. And what do you think will happen in the future? Future world borders. Today 2059 to 2061. To begin, the collapse of the Eurasian state is in full swing. With Eurasian bureaucracy in shambles, Ukrainian separatists are swiftly able to assert their sovereignty. The independence of Moldova follows soon after. In the rest of the nation, what's left of Putin's loyalists are overthrown by pro-democracy forces, establishing a new Eurasian republic. Real elections are held and a new democratically elected leader comes to office. This development could be the start of stronger Eurasian ties with the West, but only time will tell. Over in Africa, new nations are being formed. In Mali, Azawad is finally recognized as independent. The country is now divided between the dry Sahara North and the wetter, more fertile South. Anyways, what do you think will happen in the future? Future world borders. This time 2062 to 2064. In Europe, more nations unite with each other. Moldova, after 120 years apart, finally unites with their Romanian brothers. Also in the Balkans, for my most unrealistic prediction yet, Croatia, Serbia, Bosnia, and Montenegro unify. They finally realize that they speak essentially the same language and put aside their differences. Knowing the Balkans, this would never actually happen, but let's just pretend it does. Speaking of things that will never happen, Israel and Palestine finally reach a peace settlement. They agree to cease all hostilities, and Israel recognizes Palestine as a nation. In Africa, Katanga gains independence from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. This is a major blow to their economy, as the region contains many resource deposits. And what do you think will happen in the future? Future world borders. Today 2065 to 2067. In Asia, Mongolia is formally integrated into China. Over the past few decades, millions of Chinese had moved to the region. This was due to factors such as low-cost real estate investments and financial benefits from the Chinese central government. Because of Mongolia's low population, the number of Chinese in the country quickly eclipsed that of native Mongolians. This resulted in many government positions becoming held by the now Chinese majority. Negotiations were held, and a deal was made wherein Mongolia would be admitted as a special autonomous region of China. Over in Europe, more nations joined the European Federation. After years of waiting, the Baltic states are finally admitted. That's not all. Andorra also makes their grand admission into the Federation. And what do you expect to happen in the future? Future world borders. Today we'll go through 2068 to 2070. In Europe, Yugoslavia sends troops to Kosovo to assert control over the region. Since Albania is in NATO though, this activates Article 5, leading to an attack by all of their neighbors. One economic collapse and a few uprisings later, Yugoslavia has crumbled once again. You guys cannot even last 10 years without falling apart. Oh, and Hungary joins the European Federation as well. Over in Asia, the southern Kuril Islands are returned to Japan. This ends a decades-long dispute and is a positive step for relations between Japan and Eurasia. Lastly, something finally happens in South America. The former territory of French Guiana gains independence from the European Federation. Despite this, they still remain heavily subsidized by Europe and persist as the European Space Agency's base of operations. And what do you think will happen in the 2070s? Future world borders, this time 2071 to 2073. In Europe, the Federation is facing a crisis. Due to climate change, many regions near the equator have become more inhospitable to humans. Natural disasters like severe drought as well as more severe floods and monsoons have become endemic in these regions. This has led to millions moving to more habitable regions, including the European Federation. Now another migrant crisis faces Europe, and signs of division are beginning to be seen. Up north, Greenland becomes independent from the Nordic Union. Their population, though small, is growing at a rapid pace, and due to a warming Arctic, many previously inaccessible resources are now starting to be tapped into. And what do you think will happen in the future? Future world borders, today 2074 to 2076. To start, Europe faces more bad news. On top of an ongoing migrant crisis, the European housing market crashes. This ends up being the continent's biggest financial crisis of the century. This sparks more disunity in the Federation, and the potential for its collapse is becoming more real by the day. In Central Asia, a union is finally formed. All Central Asian nations unite with the key exception of Kazakhstan. Due to growing discontent with the state of the union, Kazakhstan desires to split from it. Fortunately for them, they reserve the right to split off in the union's constitution. They do so and once again become an independent state. And what do you expect to happen in the future? Future world borders, this time 2077. Over in Europe, the Federation's fate is playing out. In Southern Europe, Italy exits the Federation. This is a historic moment, as it's the first time a nation has ever left. They're not the only ones to leave though. Over in Iberia, Spain and Portugal also take their leave. Most significant of all, Andorra decides they've had enough and break away as well. At the same time, policymakers in Brussels are attempting to alleviate the economic crisis. Many are hopeful for a quick recovery, but the Federation's future is still unknown. If it's successful, the country can get back on its feet and form a stronger union. If not, they'll soon meet total collapse. Anyways, what do you think will happen? Future world borders, today 2078 to 2080. In Africa, Libya collapses. Ignoring how they've somehow held together for the past 50 years, this is a major development in Africa. Though on paper it's now three nations, their governments have little control. All of Libya is essentially a zone of anarchy, which serves as a prime base for many terror organizations. In Central Asia, Kazakhstan joins the Central Asian Union. They're now one of the world's largest nations and a major economy in Asia. Over in Europe, the Federation has managed to survive. After the passage of sweeping economic legislation, the economy managed to recover. The damage has been done, and now they look forward to the future. And what do you think will happen in the future? Future world borders, this time we'll go through 2081 to 2083. In Africa, more unions are being formed. Over in West Africa, many former French colonies join together to form a union. Increasing economic and political cooperation between these states has been taking place over the past few decades. This has culminated in a now political union between largely Francophone nations. With the nation's strong economy and growing middle class, a new African superpower has been born. Over in the Middle East, a united Arabian state is established. Replacing oil, their vast open deserts serve as the world's largest generator of solar energy. They're also one of the world's richest countries with the highest per capita income in Asia. And what do you think will happen in the future? Future world borders, this time 2084 to 2086. Over in America, Mexico officially joins the North American Union. With Spanish already as a first or second language for most citizens, the language barrier isn't much of an issue. And now that the cartels have been eliminated, Mexico takes its place as an integral part of the union. In Africa, another union is formed. In the Horn of Africa, all nations except Somalia unite. I say union, but it's more of a loose confederation with highly autonomous member states. Nevertheless, they create a new, powerful African state. Lastly, India surpasses China to become the world's largest economy. After almost a century of consistent growth, India has solidified itself as the world's strongest economy. And what do you think will happen in the future? Future world borders, today 2087. To start, something else happens in South America. The nations of South America convene in La Paz and realize that literally nothing happens on their continent. To combat this, they agree to slightly redraw their borders. In the south, Paraguay trades some land with Argentina and Brazil. On the Pacific coast, Chile cedes territory to Bolivia. This means that after over 140 years, Bolivia is finally not a landlocked country. Bolivia also gains Acre in exchange for some other territories. Lastly, Venezuela gains control over the tip of Colombia. And with that, the Conference of La Paz has concluded. And what do you think will happen in the future? Future world borders, this time 2088 to 2090. To begin, Bougainville finally gains independence. The reason it's 60 years late is because, reasons. Definitely not because I forgot or anything. Over on Mars, the human population has reached 500,000. Most of these settlers came from nations like America, China, and the European Federation. Though no nations have officially claimed ownership of any Martian land yet, it's only a matter of time. Heading back to Earth, the Federation expands once more. This time around, both Romania and Ukraine opt to join. This is a major expansion for Europe and a good sign for their future. As what do you think will happen in the future? Future world borders. This time 2091. To begin, China invades the Eurasian Union. Their goal to take control over Siberia and the vast resources it contains. Their vastly superior military easily rolls through and Eurasia is forced to surrender. At the same time, Japan uses this conflict as an opportunity to retake the rest of Kurils as well as Sakhalin. This is the last nail in the coffin for the Eurasian Union. Any semblance of government has been destroyed and what's left of Russia is now a zone of anarchy. This allows Dagestan and Chechnya to form independent nations. In addition to this, Tatarstan breaks away as well. In reaction to this situation, Europe and the Nordic send in forces to stabilize the region. Kaliningrad is partitioned and Belarus is given independence. A new pro-European government is installed in Moscow to control most of the remaining territories. Lastly, a neutral buffer state is created east of the Urals. A new Cold War has started between the West and China. The struggle between liberalism and authoritarianism has only just begun. Anyways, how do you think this will affect the world? Future world borders. Today, 2092 to 2093. In Indonesia, a pro-Chinese leader has been in power for the past decade. Over this time, they've moved towards closer ties with China and away from American influence. Obviously, the US is not happy about this as it threatens their dominance in the Indo-Pacific. To weaken this control, America discreetly funds rebel groups all across Indonesia. The first major uprising occurs on the island of New Guinea, which is harshly suppressed. America then claims that the Indonesian government is committing genocide on the island. They use this as justification to begin airstrikes and naval bombardments across the country. Operation Tropic Blitz begins and American troops are sent in. They see success in Java and southern Borneo and are quickly able to topple the government. They are unable to take control of the dense jungles though, which harbor guerrilla fighters. But their goal of destabilizing the region has been achieved, so they wind down their involvement. Indonesia is now in a full-fledged civil war between independence fighters and the remaining government forces. So tell me, who do you think will win the civil war? Future world borders. This time 2094. To begin, India is in a difficult position. Over the past few decades, they firmly aligned themselves with the Western coalition. Unfortunately for them, they're geographically isolated with firm Chinese allies on all sides. If war were to break out, they'd be the first target. To ensure their security, they greatly increased their defense budget. This goes into expanding their military's capacity as well as developing new cutting-edge defense systems. In Indonesia, the civil war progresses. Rebels on Sumatra take full control of the island, forming a new nation. The same goes for independence fighters in New Guinea. On Borneo and Java, American troops have completely withdrawn, allowing government forces to retake control. Lastly, in Europe, Belarus finally enters the European Federation. Anyways, what do you think will happen? Future world borders. This time we'll go to 2095. To begin, South America is having second thoughts. After the conference in La Paz in 2087, the continent's borders were ever so slightly changed. Despite these minor changes, the continent is realizing they were far too drastic. So to combat this, their borders returned to how they were before the conference. Classic South America. In Indonesia, the civil war concludes. Government forces have squashed all remaining rebels and order has returned. What's left of Indonesia is now a staunch Chinese ally with hopes of retaking their lost land. But before they can do so, both of the Papuas agree to unify. In the end, the civil war accomplished little other than unnecessary human suffering. So tell me, what do you think the future will bring? Future world borders. This time 2096. To start, global warming has taken its toll on the Pacific. Despite the world's transition to renewables, the impacts of global warming are still being felt. This can be most clearly seen in the Pacific, where many nations have been submerged. Nations like Micronesia and the Marshall Islands have disappeared. Others like Tuvalu and Kiribati follow suit as well. Even little Nauru succumbs to the wrath of the seas. Fortunately though, most of these nations' people managed to flee beforehand. Most arrived at places like Australia and New Zealand. Over in Africa, the East African Federation expands. After years of negotiations, Katanga and the DRC formally entered the Federation. The now Central African Federation is the dominant African power both politically and economically. So what do you think will happen in the future? Future world borders. This time we're heading to 2097. To start off, Europe unites once again. After 2 decades apart, Italy rejoins the Federation. Throughout that time, Europe's economy grew massively, making reintegration very appealing. That's not all though, the Iberian nations of Portugal and Spain reunify as well. And most importantly of all, even Andorra has deemed the Federation worthy of their reintegration. Europe's back on top and its economy continues to expand. Over in South Asia, there's bad news for Pakistan. The region of Balochistan rises up in rebellion and gains control over the region. Their success in gaining sovereignty is a bit strange though, as Pakistan's military is nothing to scoff at. Perhaps someone was supplying them with weapons for whatever reason. So tell me, what do you think will happen in the future? Future world borders. This time 2098. To start off, major news coming from Europe. After centuries of neutrality, Switzerland decides to join the European Federation. Nah, I'm just kidding, that's never gonna happen. In real news, Bulgaria and Croatia joined the Federation. And greatest of all, Liechtenstein finally opts to join in as well. Over in South Asia, the Pakistani crisis continues. After Balochistan's successful exit, the nation has started to divide into factions. Most notably, the Pashtun people occupying the nation's northwest are growing in unrest. On top of this, India continues to fund insurgent groups inside the nation. The fate of Pakistan seems to have been written, and it's only a matter of time until they collapse. So what do you think will happen next? Future world borders. Today, 2099. To start off, Pakistan completely collapses. The political turmoil that followed Balochistan's independence proved too much for them. The country is now divided into 3 separate nations. In the northwest, the majority Pashtun region separates from Pakistan. Soon after, they join with Afghanistan to unite the Pashtun people. In the south, the province of Sindh breaks off as well. What's left of Pakistan is the now former province of Punjab. There's one glaring issue with this decoupling though: nukes. Most of the warheads formerly belonging to Pakistan were transferred to Punjab, but not all. The remaining warheads were located in the Pashtun region. This means that the Taliban is now in possession of nuclear warheads, and these weapons could become operational in only a few years' time. The race to disarm the Taliban has begun. So tell me, what do you think will happen? Future world borders. Today, 2100. I know I said this was where the series would end, but we're gonna keep going. In Tehran, a meeting is held between the Taliban and the world's major nations. The topic at hand is the denuclearization of Afghanistan. Nations like China and the USA offer security guarantees in exchange for their disarmament. Considering how well so-called guarantees have done in the past, they turned down their offer. The summit has failed, and Afghanistan continues its nuclear program. In Southeast Asia, Indonesia has rebuilt. Since the end of the Civil War, Indonesia has gradually been rebuilding their forces. Thanks to outside help, their army is once again a formidable fighting force. Due to internal and external pressure, Sumatra is set to have a referendum for reunification with Indonesia in 2101. The outcome of this referendum could make or break stability in the region. Anyways, what do you think will happen? Future world borders. This time we're heading to 2101. In Afghanistan, all attempts of a diplomatic denuclearization of the Taliban have failed. At this rate, their nukes will be operational by the end of the year. The world's great powers are left with one final resort: war. In a rare showing of unity, China and the US agree to jointly invade. The coalition troops move in, and the Taliban is overthrown in a matter of weeks. The weapons are then found and swiftly disarmed. The coalition then draws down most of their troops, but some still remain to ensure stability. Mission accomplished. In Southeast Asia, Sumatra holds its reunification referendum. The results are in, and 63% voted to reunify with Indonesia. This result can be partly attributed to the economic catastrophe and food insecurity that Sumatra faced after independence. And with just a hint of election interference, Sumatra formally reunites. Anyways, what do you think will happen next? Future world borders. This time, 2102. In Asia, China's population is in freefall. Ever since their peak of 1.5 billion in 2030, their population has been gradually declining. In recent decades, though, this rate of decline has been increasing. Now their population has fallen under 1 billion, and they're losing millions every year. Though for the most part, automation has made up for the loss of labor, the consumer market has still taken a hit. All these factors mean that the Chinese economy has begun to decline, and with it, their influence. Over on Mars, the first military bases have been established. With now over 2 million people on the red planet, governments have finally established themselves. And where there's a government, there's a military. The first off-world conflicts may be right around the corner. Anyways, what do you think the future will bring? Future world borders. Today we're heading to 2103. In Central Asia, trouble has arisen. China, in an attempt to distract their population from its growing internal issues, launches a special military operation into Central Asia. They claim the nation is harboring terrorist organizations that threaten China's security. They see success in the north but are bogged down by guerrilla tactics employed by Central Asia in the mountainous southeast regions. Central Asia is also being funneled with weapons by Western forces in an attempt to combat China's advance. Only time will tell who will be the victor of this conflict. Over in North America, Quebec holds a unification referendum with America. Unsurprisingly, the French-speaking Quebecois vote no by an overwhelming margin. Never change, Quebec, never change. Anyways, what do you think will happen next? Future world borders. Today we're going to 2104. In Central Asia, China continues their advance. Up north, China's mobile ground divisions sweep across the flat Central Asian plain. And in the south, despite setbacks, they managed to capture Almaty as well as Tashkent, the nation's capital. Central Asia capitulates and unconditionally surrenders to China. As a term of the treaty, China installs an anti-terrorist government in Central Asia. And of course, to ensure all those terrorist groups are eliminated, the government gives China's military unrestricted access to their territory. The world is once again a safer place, and Europe's support for self-determination is on the rise. In recent years, Europe has begun to polarize between two major factions. On one side, there's those who support the continuation of a strong and united European state. On the other side, there's those who desire greater autonomy for individual member states and even complete independence. This polarization is only getting worse by the year, and it's slowly tearing Europe apart. So tell me, what do you think will happen? Future world borders. This time we'll go from 2105 to 2106. In Africa, West Africa is falling apart. The West African experiment appears to have failed. Due to rampant corruption and slow economic growth, nations are beginning to leave. First goes the Ivory Coast, the wealthiest nation in the Union. This exit is not treated kindly by the central government and the military is sent in. Unfortunately for the government, Senegal as well as Niger leave as well. The Union is now embroiled in a civil conflict and signs point to it only getting worse. In Southeast Asia, more conflict is afoot. In East Malaysia, Indonesian-backed separatists rise up in rebellion. Chaos ensues and much of the region falls into anarchy. Indonesia then sends in peacekeeping forces to re-establish order. Despite Malaysia's request though, the troops remain in the region and it becomes a de facto part of Indonesia. Anyways, what do you think will happen in the future? Future world borders. Today we'll head to 2107. In Asia, China's central government is losing its grip. Over the past few decades, China's economy has stagnated and even begun to decline. This has become a massive problem for the ruling government. In exchange for economic growth and improved standards of living, China's citizens had for the most part turned a blind eye to their government's authoritarian policies. But now that growth is no more and the social contract has been broken. Massive protests have erupted all throughout China demanding reforms to the system. Unlike in the past though, these demonstrations are far too large to quell and the government caves to their demands. More freedoms are allocated to the people, including the allowance of some government criticism. Overall though, this is a major hit to the central authorities' control and these reforms could spell disaster in the future. So tell me, what do you think will happen? Future world borders? This time we're going to 2108. In Europe, the Federation is beginning to break apart. In a historic moment for Europe, Bulgaria makes the decision to break off. Though their citizens still support continued trade relations, they ultimately believe that de-integration is best for the nation. Bulgaria might have been the first to officially leave, but they're not the only ones who wish to. In fact, with the exception of the Franco-German Corps, support for separation is at an all-time high throughout the Federation. In Eastern Europe specifically, with a now weak and Euro-friendly Russia, reasons for remaining have greatly diminished. It appears that after over half a century of unity, a new European age of self-determination is right around the corner. In Africa, West Africa continues to balkanize. Following a massive economic collapse, Togo and Benin decide that it's their turn to exit the Union. And following failed attempts to militarily reconquer former member states, the Union is a shell of its former self. Anyways, what do you think will happen next? Future world borders. This time 2109 to 2110. In Europe, the Federation's dissolution is put on overdrive. In the Balkans, both Hungary and Romania opt out of the Federation. And in Eastern Europe, both Ukraine and Belarus leave as well. But that's not all. In Iberia, Portugal and Spain exit for the second time. And yes, Andorra in all their great wisdom decides to go as well. It's clear now the Federation's fate is sealed. In Turkey, a hardline reactionary government has come to power. They view the independence of Kurdistan as a major loss of rightful Turkish territory. And they're not the only ones who think this, as Iraq looks to retake their former land as well. In past decades, the Federation served as a sort of police in Europe and the Middle East. But now with Europe's certain demise, a major power vacuum is opening. This could allow opportunistic governments to finally achieve their irredentist objectives. One thing is certain, the world is soon to become a much more chaotic place. Anyways, what do you think will happen? Future world borders. This time 2111. In Europe, the Federation's collapse continues. In Southern Europe, Italy, Croatia, and Slovenia make their exit. And in Eastern Europe, Poland, the Baltic states, Czechia, and Slovakia leave as well. What's left of the Federation consists only of the Franco-German Corps. In China, the nation is falling apart. In the west of the nation, armed Uyghur forces rise up in rebellion. The government's reforms have created a crack in their tight system of control. This has allowed repressed groups to vocalize their criticisms and organize in rebellion. And in the Chinese satellite of Central Asia, the pro-Chinese government has been overthrown. It appears the Chinese order is collapsing and fast. If the central government doesn't take drastic action soon, it could be all over for them. So tell me, what do you think will happen? Future world borders. This time we'll head to 2112. Over in China, East Turkestan breaks away. After Uyghur rebel forces seized most of the region, East Turkestan officially declared independence. Normally, China's military would have been able to stop this, but this time the nation's rebellions aren't isolated to just one region. In fact, essentially the entire nation is now an all-out rebellion. In regions like Tibet, local independence militias have taken control. The same goes for Mongol militias as well. And in the eastern core regions of China, many ideological factions are rising up. This has ultimately led to China's military factionalizing between separate cliques. In Manchuria, a communist faction with dreams of restoring the CCP has arisen. In the south, democratic factions have arisen as well. And in the far north, far eastern Siberia has declared independence. The second Chinese Civil War is now well underway. Anyways, what do you think will happen? Future world borders. This time 2113. In Europe, a political revolution unfolds in Russia. After over 2 decades of Euro domination, the Russian people have had enough. A new strawman leader is elected who promises to restore Russia's former glory. Their remilitarization has begun, employing new modern weapons of war. With the Federation fragmented in the west and China in a civil war in the east, the perfect opportunity for renewed Russian expansionism has arisen. lesson. Speaking of the Civil War, new developments have unfolded. After a months-long battle, the People's Liberation Army have captured Beijing. This is not only a crushing defeat for the military, but for morale as well for the loyalist forces. And in the south, democratic forces push towards Shanghai and have nearly cut off the city. It's not looking good for the former ruling government, but only time will tell who will win. Anyways, what do you think will happen? Future world borders. This time we'll go to 2114. In the Middle East, the invasion of Kurdistan commences. Both Turkey and Iraq launch a coordinated operation to occupy the nation. And though the Kurds put up a solid resistance, they are ultimately forced to capitulate. Kurdistan is then divided between the two, with Iraq re-establishing its former borders. This marks a major turning point in the way nations' disputes are handled. Before, for the most part, the role of international law and diplomacy prevailed over military conflict. And though many nations still adhere to the old order, bad actors on the world stage are increasingly willing to defy it. Over in China, the loyalists are collapsing, but the communist and democratic factions are closing in on them. The PLA has swept across the North China plain, while Shanghai and other lands have been captured in the south. The loyalists are falling apart, and it's becoming increasingly clear that this conflict will be between the remaining two factions. Anyways, what do you think will happen? Future world borders. Today we'll head to 2115, and Europe Russia begins reasserting their influence. After a not so long round of negotiations, Belarus joins the Russian Federation. The same goes for the majority Russian Ural state to the east. And while Russia expands territorially, they're also expanding their influence over former member states. In places like Ukraine, Russians still comprise much of the population, with the most recent settlements being from the days of the Eurasian Union. There also happens to be significant Russian populations in the Baltics as well. Lithuania specifically stands out, with them having taken control of the former Kaliningrad Oblast. These nations are well aware of this reality and are beginning to prepare their militaries for a potential invasion. In China, the loyalists fold. What's left of the loyalist forces have crumbled, allowing the other two factions to sweep in and take control. This civil war is now a two-sided conflict, and perhaps the most brutal stage of it is about to begin. Anyways, what do you think will happen? Future world borders. This time we'll go to 2116. In Southeast Asia, Indonesia makes another move. In East Timor, the democratically elected government is overthrown by the military. Their citizens begin to protest on the streets, destabilizing the country. And as the region's peacekeeper, Indonesia sends peacekeeping forces to stabilize the nation. And to make sure the peace is held, they decide to remain there indefinitely. In America, dissatisfaction is beginning to grow. After narrowly avoiding civil war in the 2020s and 30s, America has enjoyed a long era of relative stability. This era seems to have come to a close, though, after the polarizing presidential election of 2116. The electoral victory of now President-elect Donald DeSantis III Jr. has firmly divided the nation. While his supporters claim he's the best president in a generation, his opponents claim he'll drive the country into the ground. A rift is beginning to form, and it's one that could have dire consequences. Anyways, what do you think will happen? Future world borders. Today we'll go to 2117. In China, the CCP expands their control. Mongolia, after realizing they won't be able to hold on to their non-core territories, offers to return them to China. After numerous rounds of negotiation, Mongolia agrees to cede Inner Mongolia to the CCP. In exchange for this deal, they agree to guarantee the independence of Mongolia and relinquish all claims over their territory. With their northern borders secured, they turn their eyes south. Near the coast, their forces advance south until they reach the Yangtze. And in the interior, they push through the Sichuan Basin towards the key city of Chengdu. Though southern China is being pushed back, they aren't sitting idly by. They form the pact with Tibet and East Turkestan, ensuring their sovereignty for military support in the war. Though their capabilities may be limited, their attacks near the border serve to divert the PLA, easing pressure for democratic forces along the main front. Anyways, what do you think will happen next? Future world borders. Today we're going to 2118. In East Asia, Siberia returns to Russian hands. A few years ago, a pro-Russian coup took over Siberia's government and forged closer ties with a resurgent Russian state. This ultimately led to reunification between the two, granting Russia access to the Pacific once again. Though this merger was peaceful, the same cannot be said for Tatarstan. Russian tanks have rolled into the nation, taking out their woefully unprepared military in a matter of months. And despite resistance efforts, they're eventually reintegrated into Russia as well. Over in South America, something finally happens. Though no borders are changed, a road is finally constructed through the Darien Gap. This finally connects North and South America by road, completing the Pan-American Highway. Anyways, what do you think will happen? Future world borders. This time we'll head to 2119. In Europe, a new defensive alliance is formed. In Eastern Europe, Ukraine, Poland, and the Baltic states create a defensive pact. Though it protects members from any outside invaders, it's aimed specifically at Russia, and for good reason, considering Russia's recent expansionist tendencies. Over in China, a decisive battle is being decided. Though the Western Front has mostly stalled, the East has seen significant action. The CCP has now reached the outskirts of Shanghai, with massive urban fighting taking place. Finally, in South America, something happens nations once again. To clean up their borders, Colombia agrees to cede this small panhandle to Brazil in return for payment. Considering this monumental change, it appears that the gears of South American geopolitics are beginning to turn. Anyways, what do you think will happen? Future world borders. This time we're going to 2120. In America, the decisive election of 2120 occurs. It's between incumbent President Donald DeSantis III Jr. and Dr. Professor Joe Obama. It's a tight race with both candidates winning a similar amount of electoral votes. Now the race is to be decided by one state, Nebraska. You see, in 2120, Nebraska is the most populated state in the country with over 90 million people. Because of this, it has 100 electoral votes and is the most important state for candidates to win. By the narrowest of margins, Dr. Professor Joe Obama wins the state and is elected the next president. Of course, the other side demands a recount, but the results end up the same. Despite this, supporters of Donald DeSantis still claim there was election fraud, severely damaging the public's trust in the election's integrity. The nation is once again more divided than before, but the worst has yet to come. Anyways, what do you think will happen? Future world borders. This time we're heading to 2121. In South America, tensions are beginning to ramp up. Relations are beginning to be strained between Bolivia and Brazil over control of Acre. You see, the current Bolivian government seeks to mostly re-establish the border set by the 2087 Treaty of La Paz. Of course, only the sections of the treaty that gave them more territory. And that's not all, they also wish to reclaim their lost coastline from Chile. To defend against the Bolivian menace, Chile and Brazil form a pact. Fortunately for Bolivia, they aren't the only ones who want something from Brazil. Up north in Colombia, the people desire to reclaim the small panhandle they ceded to Brazil. And lastly, Argentina seeks to take down Brazil as well, their greatest geopolitical foe on the continent. Together, the three form the Triple Alliance, greatly heightening tensions. It seems that South America may soon devolve into the greatest conflict the continent has ever seen. Anyways, what do you think will happen? Future world borders. Today we're going to 2122. In China, the civil war has grinded to a halt. Other than some minor changes, the front line has essentially become stagnant. This, coupled with diminishing support for the war's continuation, has led to both sides agreeing to a ceasefire. The two sides meet in Shanghai to discuss the terms of ceasefire, unofficially ending the civil war. In the Middle East, Turkey continues its expansion. On the island of Cyprus, the Turkish-backed Republic of Northern Cyprus occupies the southern half of the island. Soon after, a referendum is held and they officially become Turkish territory. This action is condemned by the Greek government, but their protests are ignored. Instead, Turkey responds by massively increasing naval and air activity in the Aegean Sea. Anyways, what do you think will happen? Future world borders. Today we're going to 2123. To begin, in Europe, Turkey occupies Greek islands in the Aegean Sea. Continuing their recent expansion of influence, Turkish forces occupy many nearby Greek islands. And though Greek forces do put up resistance, they're ultimately forced off them. This essentially begins a low-intensity war between the two nations. Over in Eastern Europe, Russian separatists rise up in Kaliningrad and eastern Ukraine. Supported by Russia, the Russian-majority Kaliningrad region declares independence from Lithuania. The same goes for Russian-speaking regions in eastern Ukraine. Many of these uprisings are put down by Ukraine's military, but rebel forces manage to retain control in Crimea and Donbass. Though technically not an official war between them and Russia, this conflict's intensity will only increase. Anyways, what do you think will happen? Future world borders. This time 2124. In America, the election of 2124 occurs. It's once again between now President Dr. Professor Joe Obama and former President Donald DeSantis III Jr. After weeks of counting, the winner is no one. In fact, even by the second day of counting, members of both parties began protesting that the election was fraudulent. The country is now in a deep crisis of leadership, causing states to prepare for the worst. If a winner isn't decided by January 20th, America in its current form may cease to exist. Over in South America, a continent-wide conference will soon be held. All major South American nations plan to hold a conference in Paraguay in 2126. The hope is that here, tensions and disputes between the continental powers may be solved. If successful, the centuries-long peace on the continent may hold. Anyways, what do you think will happen? Future world borders. Today we're heading to 2125. In America, the Union stands divided. January 20th came and went with no winner to the election having been decided. And though President Joe Obama remains the holder of the office, his legitimacy has been completely destroyed in the eyes of Republicans. As a result of this, on January 24th, 2125, South Carolina becomes the first state to secede from the Union. This is followed in quick succession by most of the South as well as the interior interior. As the dominoes continue to fall, Mexico breaks away as well. The same goes for Canada in the north. And even though individual states choose a side, uprisings for both sides occur in most states. The two major factions led by Joe Obama and Donald DeSantis respectively now fight to restore the union. Anyways, which side do you think will win? Future world borders. Today we're heading to 2126. In South America, a continent-wide conference is held. The leaders of all South American nations meet in Paraguay to discuss plans for continued peace on the continent. All is going well until Bolivian President Eduardo Lopez is assassinated by a Paraguayan nationalist. This outrages the Bolivian government, causing them to send an ultimatum for reparations from Paraguay. Paraguay declines, leading Bolivia to declare war. Brazil then steps in against Bolivia to defend Paraguay, and in reaction to this, Argentina in turn declares war on Brazil. The chain of alliances continue to activate until almost the entire continent is at war. It seems the conference has caused exactly what it set out to prevent, an all-out war on the continent. As which side do you think will win the war? Future world borders. This time we're going to 2127. In South America, the continental war continues. In Patagonia, the Chileans, completely surrounded by the enemy, are pushed back in the north. Over in Paraguay, the Argentines, hoping to quickly end the war, push hard through the country. Their capital, being right on the border, is quickly captured, delivering a devastating blow to morale. Argentina is hoping to be able to trap Brazilian forces in the south to deliver a crushing blow. Over in Bolivia, though, the Brazilians are making steady gains. Finally, up north, Colombian forces push across Venezuela's flat northern plain. Next, in America, both sides consolidate their territory. In the west, Democratic forces capture the coastal regions linking up with Cascadia. And out east, the entire northeast region has been taken, and they now push to link up with the Great Lakes. In the south and lower Midwest, though, Democratic uprisings have been crushed by Republican forces. With their domains consolidated, both sides prepare for a frontal offensive. Anyways, what do you think will happen? Future world borders. This time 2128. And Europe war faces the continent once again. With Europe disunited and the USA in disarray, a perfect opportunity has arisen for Russia. They now officially annex Crimea and Donbass in eastern Ukraine. This is an act of war, activating their defense alliance with Poland and the Baltics. Russia quickly takes control of the Suwalki Gap, cutting the Baltics off. And with their comparatively low firepower, they are overrun by the end of the year. In Ukraine, unlike a century prior, Russia focuses almost completely in the south from the start. This allows them to capture the country's coastline, almost completely cutting them off from global trade. In America, the Battle of the Midwest begins. Democratic forces have managed to reach Cleveland and Detroit, but in Minneapolis, after years of fighting, the city finally falls to the Republicans. If Democrats manage to reach Chicago, though, it can mark a turning point, positioning them to take control of the Great Lakes. Anyways, what do you think will happen? Future world borders. Today we're heading to 2129. In South America, the war expands to the Antarctic. With Chile being pushed from all sides, they need to find a way to divert enemy forces. In exchange for being promised Argentina's Antarctic territory, the UK joins the war on the Chilean side. Together, they quickly crush Argentine forces in the Antarctic while Britain's navy bombards Argentina's coast. Then in southern Patagonia, a joint Anglo-Chilean assault is launched. With Argentine forces now distracted in the south, this allows Brazil to make major gains. Up north, though, Colombia is able to take Venezuela's capital, forcing their capitulation. Over in Europe, things get worse for Ukraine and Poland. Russia and Hungary have made a deal wherein they join the war against Ukraine in exchange for Carpathia. The Hungarians advance, catching the Ukrainians off guard and swiftly capturing the region. The two are now in a seemingly hopeless situation, and their defeat appears certain. Anyways, what do you think will happen? Future world borders. This time we're going to 2130. In America, the Democrats advance in the Great Lakes. Democratic forces, aided by Canada and the European Federation, push towards Chicago. Their advance, though, is stopped by the Republicans at South Bend, where the deadliest battle of the war commences. This battle lasts 2 months, seeing fierce fighting from both sides, resulting in tens of thousands of casualties. Eventually, though, the Republicans are beaten out of the city, allowing Chicago to be reached. Over the remainder of the year, the rest of the Great Lakes are recaptured as well. In Europe, Russia's war meets its conclusion. Faced with intensely strained supplies and overwhelming force, the Polish-Ukrainian lines begin to collapse. Kyiv is eventually captured, with the rest of Ukraine falling soon after. To prevent Poland from being entirely captured by Russia, the European Federation sends in forces to occupy the west. The two sides meet at the Vistula River, marking the war's end. Anyways, what do you think will happen? Future world borders. Today, 2131. In South America, the war turns against Argentina. In exchange for their panhandle and parts of Venezuela, Colombia agrees to exit the war and end their occupation of Venezuela. The same goes for Peru, whose populace sees the war as an unfruitful endeavor. Argentina, now realizing the gravity of their situation, makes one final push against Brazil. Though they manage to break through Brazilian lines and make gains, their attack is soon stopped and subsequently repelled. Following this, the Brazilians push south while the Brits and Chileans continue their push north. With them being closed in on all sides, Argentina's government sends a request for an armistice. This is accepted by the defenders, marking Argentina and Bolivia's surrender and ending the 5-year-long war. The Treaty of Brasilia is then signed, giving Britain Argentina Antarctica, with Chile getting border regions and Brazil receiving some northern provinces. With the war over, peace at last has been returned to the continent. Anyways, what do you think will happen? Future world borders. This time 2132. In America, the Democrats attempt to starve out the Republicans, and the Midwest Democratic forces reach the city of St. Louis. Despite their attempts to cross the Mississippi, though, they're unable to do so, preventing their capture of the city. And out east, their attacks are thwarted in Appalachia and Virginia. Though both sides are making gains, they're slow and costly. These slow gains by both sides are in part due to both receiving supplies from external players. While the UK and European Federation supply the Democrats, Russia sends substantial military aid to the Republicans. To stop this flow, the Democrats partner with Europe to navally blockade their only ocean access in the south. Though the initial goal was to block Russian imports, it soon expands to all imports entering Republican territory. If the Republicans can't find a way to end the blockade, they'll soon be starved out, allowing the Democrats to gain the upper hand. Anyways, what do you think will happen? Future world borders. Today, 2133. In the Caucasus, Russia reclaims their territory. With their western flank now secured, Russia turns their eyes south. Russian forces move into Chechnya and Dagestan in an attempt to regain their lost land. The two nations put up fierce resistance, catching Russian forces off guard and extending the conflict. Eventually, though, Russia manages to recapture the nations and formally reintegrates them back into the country. In the wake of Russia's westward expansion, the European Federation establishes the European Security Organization. The ESO acts much like the long-dead NATO, ensuring a response from all members in the instance of attack. With Czechia, Slovakia, and the Nordic Union joining as founding members, the ESO serves as a barrier to future Russian expansion in Europe. Anyways, what do you think should happen next? Future world borders. This time 2134. In America, the Republicans face internal upheaval. With damaged internal supply chains and a complete shutoff of external imports, Republican forces struggle to resupply. In addition to this, the general populace are in dire straits, leading to uprisings in the cities. To add insult to injury, the Republican government and military has factionalized on regional lines, hindering their organization. The Democrats take full advantage of this, connecting their territories by land and splitting the Republicans in two. They continue this northern push from both sides of the country. Completely depleted of supply and hundreds of miles away from the bulk of the army, Republican forces in the west capitulate. Capitalizing on their momentum, the Democrats push through the Mississippi Valley, Gulf Coast, and eastern seaboard. With defeat appearing inevitable, mass mutinies take hold of Republican ranks, further solidifying their fate. Finally, on Christmas Eve, Democratic forces capture their capital, Atlanta. What's left of the Republican government sends an official notice of their surrender, ending the Civil War. Anyways, what do you think will happen next? Future world borders. Today, 2135. In Southeast Asia, Indonesia begins to destabilize. On the island of Timor, Australian-funded insurgent groups rise up. Though they manage to be put down, this rebellion shows signs of cracks in the country's unity. With more insurgent groups being funded by Malaysia as well, Indonesia could once again face internal conflict. In Europe, the ESO expands to the Balkans. Seeking protection from potential invasion, the nations of Slovenia, Croatia, Romania, and Albania all join. The ascension of Albania specifically is met by Serbian protests who still, after 127 years, claim Kosovo as part of their country. Nevertheless, Albania is still admitted, once again heating up tensions in the Balkans. In America, reconstruction begins. Now that the war is over, America focuses on rebuilding the damage caused by the Civil War. As a result of this, America enters another age of isolation and delegates little effort to foreign policy. Anyways, what do you think will happen next? Future world borders. This time 2136. In the Balkans, Bosnia faces collapse. Furthering renewed tensions in the Balkans, the Republic of Srpska breaks away from Bosnia. What remains of Bosnia now falls into complete disorder. In reaction to this development, the Russian-backed Serbians move into the country to restore peace. And though not officially declared, all of Bosnia subsequently comes under de facto Serbian control. In the Caribbean, the Bahamas is no more. As the effects of climate change raged on, sea levels began to rise in many places. Though most nations were able to prevent their land from being taken by the seas, the Bahamas was less fortunate. Now, after a century of gradual sea level rise, essentially the entire country has been submerged. Anyways, what do you think will happen next? Future world borders. Today, 2137. In Asia, tensions heat up once again. The CCP launches an invasion into East Turkestan and Tibet to secure their western border. Tibet specifically has been quickly drifting away from the CCP's influence, forming greater ties with nations like India. To stop this increasing foreign influence, they militarily occupied the two nations. As a result of this, the CCP now has complete control over the sources of China's two major rivers, the Yellow and Yangtze. This puts southern China in a vulnerable position as the CCP can now profoundly affect the river's flow from upstream. In the Middle East, the Arabian Union grows. After decades of negotiations and further integration, the nations of Hejaz, Yemen, and Oman all joined the Union. As well as uniting the entire Arabian Peninsula, this unification expands the country's hegemony over solar production. Now, what do you think will happen next? Future world borders. This time 2138. In Asia, a continental alliance is formed. In reaction to the CCP's occupation of East Turkestan and Tibet, many Asian nations seek greater security. That's why this year the nations of India, South China, Korea, and Japan joined forces to create a defensive pact. The CCP doesn't sit idly by though, and soon after formalizes a counter pact with Russia and other close allies. Now almost all nations in Eurasia are members of one of these three collective defense pacts. In the Caucasus, conflict erupts once again. The nation of Georgia, seeking out protection, has now officially applied for a mission into the ESO. Before it can be ratified though, Russia invades the nation and topples their government. Following this, a new Russian-sponsored government is set up, which soon after rescinds their application to the ESO. Anyways, what do you think will happen next? Future world borders. Today, 2139. In Eurasia, more nations choose sides. Over the past few years, tensions on Eurasia have drastically increased. With tensions in the Balkans, China, and Southeast Asia, it's only a matter of time before war erupts. In Europe, the ESO expands in Southern Europe and the British Isles. Out of these, both of the continent's defensive pacts make gains in Southeast Asia and Oceania. The same is true in the Middle East and Eastern Mediterranean. Tension flashpoints are littered across the continent, like the Greco-Turkish conflict, Chinese border skirmishes, and Arab-Iranian rivalry. Before, when conflicts broke out, they'd largely be limited to their respective region. But now, with most nations associated with larger defensive pacts, any one of these could spark a large, far-reaching conflict. And with nuclear-armed nations on all sides, a war would be immensely destructive and could end up being humanity's last. Anyways, what do you think will happen? Future world borders. This time, 2140. In the Balkans, Serbia invades Kosovo. Serbia claims that Albanian forces crossed their border and occupied nearby settlements. Though Albania denies Serbia's assertion, they use it as justification to send forces into Kosovo anyways. Because Albania is in the ESO though, the entire alliance comes to their aid. But because Serbia's allies view Albania as the aggressor, they join the war on Serbia's side. War now engulfs all of Europe, but this is only the beginning. Over in China, emboldened by this new conflict, the CCP launches an assault into southern China. And as they're in a defensive pact of their own, their allies join the war against the CCP. What started as a minor border engagement has now spiraled into a new world war. The destruction it will cause will be immense, the likes of which humanity has never seen. Anyways, what do you think will happen? Future world borders. Today, 2141. In Europe, the first battles of the war commence. In the Balkans, the ESO pushes through Carpathia and cuts both Hungary and Serbia off. Cut off and surrounded by enemies, the two nations are quickly captured. At the same time, the Russian forces push across Romania. Another offensive across the Vistula is launched as well, capturing much of western Poland. In southern Europe, a joint Russo-Turkish assault captures Bulgaria and much of Greece. Finally, up north, the Russians push into Finland and Sweden. Though a defensive line has been established along the Oder River, it is at high risk of a Russian breakthrough. Over in the Middle East, the Eurasian alliance sweeps across Jordan and Saudi Arabia. And in South and East Asia, while India captures Punjab, the CCP overwhelms Korea and advances into the south. Though all sides trade blows, the Eurasian pact appears to be taking the upper hand. Anyways, what do you think will happen? Future world borders. This time, 2142. In Europe, Eurasian forces break through. The ESO's defensive line along the Oder River is beginning to fall apart. With their enemy's forces in disarray, Eurasian armies launch a spearhead across the North German plain. Many divisions are cornered and soon after captured. They don't stop there though, pushing to the lowlands and capturing Brussels, the Federation's capital. And following their capture of Paris, the Federation capitulates. In the Balkans, Eurasian forces liberate Hungary and Serbia and continue until they reach the Alps. And up north, after the capture of most population centers, the Nordic Union falls as well. Italy, the UK, and the nations of Iberia are now all that remains of the ESO on the continent. Anyways, what do you think will happen? Future world borders. Today, 2143. In Asia, the Indo-Pacific Alliance strikes back. Though much of the front hasn't changed for a while, this is true no longer. In Myanmar, India, and southern and China launch a joint attack. Considering their isolation from the rest of their allies' forces, their government falls by the year's end. But that's not all, as amphibious landings take place at strategic points in Indonesia. With both the Sunda and Malacca Straits now under Indo-Pacific control, their naval dominance has been firmly cemented. This is in addition to Indo-Pacific control over the Suez Canal and the exit to the Sea of Okhotsk. Because of this, Eurasia's naval power has been heavily limited outside of Europe. Speaking of Europe, all advances have essentially stopped as both sides take defensive positions. Anyways, what do you think will happen? Future world borders. This time 2144. In Europe, the ESO receives external supplies. Though not technically in the war, both the US and Canada have begun sending military aid to Europe. Thanks to this, the ESO is able to continue normal military operations and even go on the offensive. In the Middle East, the tides of war turn. Having now fully mobilized both their militaries and economies, the Indo-Pacific Alliance begins a counter-offensive. Thanks to their poor supply lines, Eurasian forces are routed and forced to retreat. This allows Indo-Pacific forces to push north from Arabia and west from India. And over in Korea, Eurasia is pushed all the way back to the Chinese border. Finally, in Indonesia, Java, Sumatra, and other major islands are captured as well. Anyways, what do you think will happen? Future world borders. Today, 2145. In Europe, the ESO still holds on. As military shipments from North America have increased, the ESO's military capabilities have gradually increased as well. Slow but steady gains have defined the last year as they've recaptured southern France and much of Dalmatia. With Eurasian forces heavily tied up in Asia, they need to find a way to stop these transatlantic shipments. They accomplish this by setting up a naval blockade on Europe's western coast, firing at any ships that cross it. Despite this, shipments are still sent, with the US warning that the sinking of their ships would lead to direct conflict. Eurasia attempts to call their bluff and proceeds to sink numerous North American ships, violating the blockade. But a bluff it was not, and soon after, both the US and Canada joined the war against Eurasia on the side of the ESO. Anyways, what do you think will happen? Future world borders. This time 2146. In Europe, the ESO launches an offensive. With American and Canadian troops flooding in, the European stalemate has broke. In a stunning reversal of Eurasia's offensive, 4 years prior, ESO troops retake much of occupied Federation territory. In the Balkans, they push south and east, liberating Greece and reaching the banks of the Bosphorus. Turkey also faces a southern attack from the Indo-Pacific Alliance, reaching Ankara and causing their capitulation. And out of these, the Chinese stalemate breaks as well, and the Indo-Pacific Army takes full advantage. From Korea, their forces advance deep into Manchuria, and from the south, they push north, reaching the outskirts of Beijing. This year has been an astounding military failure for Eurasia, which could cause them to take desperate measures. Anyways, what do you think will happen? Future world borders. Today, 2147. In Europe, the ESO advances east. ESO forces push into Scandinavia, reaching all the way to the Russian border. And on the main front, a major offensive is launched. From the south, they sweep over the flat plains of Ukraine, reaching the North Caucasus. And in the north, they advance through the Baltics all the way to St. Petersburg. They're not only facing attacks externally though, but internally as well, as its people are tired of war. The people rise up and topple what's left of the government, negotiating their nation's surrender soon after. And in China, Beijing has been captured by Indo-Pacific forces as well. With all hope for victory now lost, what's left of the Eurasian alliance officially surrenders. And with that, the war is over and peace has been restored. Future world borders. Now that the war has ended, a treaty redrawing Eurasia's borders has been signed. In Europe, Eastern European countries formerly occupied by Russia regained their independence. Russia itself is also forced to disarm, retaining only a moderately sized military solely for the purpose of defense. In the Balkans, Bosnia regains its independence and Hungary returns Carpathia to Ukraine. And over in Greece, islands occupied by Turkey are returned to them. In Southeast Asia, Malaysia regains North Borneo from Indonesia. And on the island of Timor, East Timor regains its sovereignty as well. Finally, for perhaps the treaty's most major change, China is reunited by the democratic South. They also re-establish the independence of both Tibet and East Turkestan.